The Metroid series had already had two fairly successful games on its hands, one that laid the foundation of the Metroidvania genre as a whole, and another that improved upon a lot of the ideas the other one had and pushed the bar forward. And while those games were great, the series needed something huge. It needed something gigantic. It needed something super. And so, in March of 1994, the world would finally be graced with Super Metroid. Considering all the gains Metroid 2 brought to the series were essentially placed on Super, and considering Super caused Metroid 2's long-term relevance to pretty much disappear, I figured it had to have done something right. But what I never could have expected was just how much of a leap forward Super Metroid was. I had been told time and time again that Super Metroid was amazing, and with that obviously came some high expectations. And yet, despite that, Super Metroid didn't just live up to my lofty expectations, it exceeded them. So, at the end of Metroid 2, Samus manages to befriend a lone baby Metroid, one that essentially took Samus in as its mother. With this newfound baby Metroid, the Galactic Federation hoped that it might be able to use it for the overall greater good. Great. Samus leaves the baby Metroid on the Ceres space colony to be studied, but not long after Samus left the colony, she receives a distress call coming from the very same colony. Not great. So Samus returns to the ship only to find that the baby Metroid has already been stolen by one of the leaders of the space pirates and her eternal rival, Ridley. After a brief fight, Ridley escapes down to planet Zebes, the location of the first Metroid game interestingly enough, and Samus follows after him in hopes of retrieving the baby Metroid before something terrible happens. Something that is really impressive about Super Metroid is just how much of a step up it is over its predecessors in regards to how it builds its atmosphere. Metroid 2 was certainly impressive for a Game Boy game and all, but it has nothing on this. Upon entering the Ceres space colony, you're greeted with nothing but ambient sound. No high-octane adventurous tracks, just the light sounds of machines in the background. Considering the tone of Super Metroid, it wouldn't have worked at all if they started blaring some crazy music. Sometimes, silence speaks louder than anything, and this is one of those cases. As you continue through, you'll find the place ominously empty, no scientists or researchers to speak of. And when you finally do find them, well, let's just say things aren't looking too good. As the anxiety builds and builds, things finally reach a breaking point when Ridley is introduced. Suddenly, this loud boss theme begins to play and you're forced to deal with something that clearly just massacred the entire ship. Then, as you escape the ship and land on Zebes, things get quiet again, and you're forced to return to the very same area you helped to destroy back in Metroid 1. And, as expected, the area is desolate and empty. No space pirates, no wildlife, no signs of intelligent life at all. Just you and these weird green bugs. As you delve deeper in, you're forced to interact with the base in a much more decrepit state. The creators made sure to show that these areas aren't completely overrun with wildlife. If the entire place had been taken over by plants and animals completely, well, that just wouldn't make sense. Sure, it's been a long enough while where some signs of wear should be showing, but not long enough where the place should be completely overrun. It's a smart move by the developers, and they made sure to show that yes, this place is aging, and considering the green bugs have begun infesting these areas, there are some early signs of wildlife beginning to enter, but they never go so far where it gets extreme. This adds a layer of believability to the world, and shows an insane attention to detail. And this attention to detail extends even farther. Once you reach Brinstar, get a new upgrade, and get to see a fairly spot-on recreation of the starting area of Metroid 1, you'll begin heading towards the planet's surface, only for the silence to end and for you to be attacked by some space pirates. Two things here. Firstly, I find it fascinating how often Super Metroid plays with music like this. Considering the past two games never even attempted this, I just like how much focus Super Metroid puts on deciding whether to play music or go quiet things down a bit. This approach allows for the game to have more ability to highlight key moments, as silence is often a good way to get the player really paying attention to what's going on. Now that's cool, but there's something else going on here that I feel like often gets overlooked when discussing Super Metroid. After you beat those space pirates on the surface, you may have expected to find more waiting for you after that, only to find that once you get off the surface, there really aren't that many space pirates. Taking a page from Metroid 2's book, Super Metroid again uses enemies as part of its environmental storytelling. You may ask, why are there so few of them? And I think the answer is fairly obvious if you think about it for a bit. We literally destroyed the base in Metroid 1. While there were likely some survivors, it only makes sense that they're a little low on forces at this point. This is such a brilliant touch and further adds to the game's ongoing attempts to truly showcase the aftermath of your escapades in Metroid 1. This whole concept of forcing past game decisions into the current one becomes more obvious in the next game in the lineup, Metroid Fusion, but regardless, it's neat that Super Metroid goes this far. It gives added weight to your actions before this game, and is one of those things that Metroid often does to make its world feel bigger. And speaking of bigger, well, Super Metroid certainly is, and no, I'm not just talking about the overall bigger world. Which, yes, the game is much bigger than anything seen before, but an important note is that it doesn't just look bigger, the world feels bigger as well. In Metroid 1, the game had very little to differentiate the areas due to the game's goofy design and lack of any interesting set pieces. And one large complaint during my Metroid 2 video was how the game was very repetitive visually and lacked in any real memorable sections. Super Metroid finally realizes what kind of world this one can be. I mean, over the course of one game, we go through a cave system, an abandoned space pirate base, an area overgrown with plants, a desolate, destroyed ship, a peaceful underwater area, and the list goes on. The variety to Super Metroid's world design pretty much runs circles around what came before. Even cooler is that this variety isn't just in how the environment is built either. Rooms in past games were, well, simplistic as the hardware would likely require. In Super Metroid, though, they cram in so much more detail into the rooms. There are now genuine things in the background, not just a black screen. The floors, ceiling, walls, etc. all have much more going on. They can be mechanical structures, decaying structures, and heck, even when it's just a normal rock, they make sure the tiles don't usually repeat. Rooms now have things going on as well. There are a number of interesting set pieces and structures, and rooms never just feel like they were tossed in to fill space. Each one has something to see. No more repeated rooms or dull cave systems. Pretty much every room in Super Metroid has something going on, and they usually have a much more interesting approach to the upgrades in these as well. Now, these were certainly present in past games, pickups that allow you to increase Samus's missile capacity or health. The difference is that in past games they were usually just sitting around or placed in a block that must be destroyed despite visually looking no different from those around it. Super Metroid is the first game in the series to really put focus on how you go about getting them. Sure, every once in a while the game throws you a bone and just hands you one, but most of the time they're held behind some kind of puzzle. Usually the player will walk into a room and see some bizarre structure they can't really interact with due to them requiring a different ability that they may not have. The design choice is brilliant because it creates a situation where the player will remember that room. It's hard not to when the promise of tantalizing goodies lies just beyond. And so, when the player inevitably returns with the proper ability in tow, the prize is all the sweeter. This not only makes the upgrades feel like a much bigger reward, but it also makes the idea of backtracking, a staple of the genre, seem like an actually fun and good idea. Most times while playing, I'd have this urge to sweep on by some previous areas just to see if I could get anything new, and man, nothing beats going through a previously impassable room only to find an energy tank waiting at the end. The feeling is like no other. Something even cooler about Super Metroid, though, is that these upgrades don't always require the new ability, even if the circumstances would seem to imply that. If you're adept at using Samus's myriad of abilities, like the wall jump for example, you can get a number of upgrades in unintended ways. This rewards out-of-the-box thinking in a way that not many games can, and means that replaying this game is an even better experience. Once you've already learned how to finesse the game, you can do a number of things in unintended ways. Seriously, the game feels like an entirely different beast because of this. It almost feels like you're outsmarting the developers themselves. Not only upgrades, but even bosses can be fought out of order if you know what you're doing. This non-linear way of approaching these upgrades gives the game a very different feel from the previous games, and makes this game a joy to return to once you've really gotten to grips with the game's mechanics. Thankfully as well, the game puts these upgrades to good use, because you are going to need them for some of the combat encounters in this game. Combat in this game is so much slicker than the previous games as well. Samus, while floaty, generally feels tighter and more responsive than before, and like Metroid 2, the increased shot size and sizable enemy sprites makes the basic baddies a lot more fun to contend with. And with Samus's new upgrade in mobility, and with the overall increased screen size, they were allowed to make combat more of a priority than it was in Metroid 2. Enemies are more difficult to deal with this time around, and feature many more dangerous ways of fighting Samus. Past games enemies often did very little besides just try and run in a direction hoping it would hit Samus, but here they chase you, they shoot projectiles at you, they try to fly down from above. There's just a much larger breadth of ways they can attack you, making the combat feel more dynamic than past games. Combine this with the multitude of beam types Samus can use, and missiles now being much more viable for combat, and you get a combat system that is much more fun on the player's end, and with enemies much more fun to face. It's a serious step up over what came before in pretty much every way, and makes the game feel more action-focused than past games. Really, the only case where the controls falter is when you're stuck in rooms with either obstacles that completely halt Samus's momentum, like spike rooms, or things that trap Samus, like these annoying flowers or the quicksand from Meridia. The controls are still a bit floaty, and while it works most of the time, these cases completely destroy the gameplay flow and just feel kinda odd. Like, the way Samus bounces around just doesn't feel natural, and geez, getting stuck in the quicksand not only causes the momentum and speed to halt, but it also completely screws with your jump, making it really hard to get out of it since the platforms are always just a bit too high in these areas. And while I'm on this note, I might as well get another gripe I have out of the way. The space jump and wall jump maneuvers, while really useful, feel a bit clunky at times. Maybe it's just me, but I noticed several times throughout both playthroughs where the space jump or wall jump would just not work, sending me plummeting back to the bottom of the room. The wall jump in general is really weird to get used to the first time as well. I recall spending several minutes just trying to get out of this chasm, but falling each time because the wall jump was so finicky. It got better as I went on, but I won't deny that it's still an issue even this time. It's not a huge deal, but I'll admit it did irritate me from time to time. This isn't my last issue with the game, but we'll get to that later. So, I talked a whole lot about the intro sequence and how wonderfully themed it is, but the beauty of Super Metroid is that this brilliant design doesn't end with the intro. Every single area seems to be crafted not only with fun in mind, but also crafted with environmental storytelling and theming in mind as well. Let me give you one of my favorite examples. After getting the grapple beam, you head east of your ship only to find an abandoned docking area and a desolate ship. As you'll soon find out once heading in there, the place is completely deserted. No living beings in sight. The place looks destroyed too, with everything giving off the impression that it really hasn't been touched in years. So, you head to the save room only to find out that, hey, I can't save, like the machine isn't even working. This and unopenable doors make it abundantly clear that there is no power being given to the ship, and this is such a neat way of accomplishing that. I mean, taking power from the doors is one thing, but the fact that they went out of their way to disable the ability to save, a potentially vital thing for the player to do at this point, just to prove a point, that's some crazy attention to detail. The creepy wrecked ship, the ominous music, the lack of life, the lack of power, and most importantly, the lack of an ability to save puts the player in a much more desperate mindset. It also doesn't help that this ship appears to be haunted or something, as this weird amalgamate things just seems to come and go as it pleases. Once you reach the basement and take care of the boss, the power is restored and the place suddenly seems much more lively. The ghosts are gone and instead we just have these weird robots present. It's such a neat tonal shift and finishes off what is one of the coolest areas in the game if I'm being honest. The best part is that the whole game is designed like this. Sure, this is certainly the best example, but it really can't be overstated just how far this approach goes in making the game as a whole a lot more memorable. Even better is that no area goes for the same tone as the last. The overgrowth area is adventurous, Meridia is melancholic, Ridley's lair is ominous and imposing. That's what I mean. There's a lot of variety, and this variety also means Super Metroid never gets stale. It always feels like there's something new to do, new to see, and it always seems like there's something different to experience as the game goes on. It's hard not to be taken in by the game when it's just so exciting to see what's going to happen next. It also helps that the game is just drop-dead gorgeous in general. Seriously, as far as the SNES goes, there aren't many games quite as beautiful as this one. It's not just that the game has a higher amount of pixels. Instead, it's that they really made sure everything looked distinct and was crafted with much more detail than the games prior could even handle. I'm serious, as far as I'm concerned, this is probably the prettiest looking game on the SNES, and certainly one of the coolest looking games in the entire series, that's for sure. But you know, I guess I was lying a bit earlier. Not every area is crafted with the same care. There's one area in this game that feels like it doesn't really belong, like it didn't get quite as much love while being designed. Of course, I'm talking about Meridia. Now to start positive, I will note that this area is definitely still pretty, and it certainly has the same level of detail put into building its atmosphere, that being one of a melancholic underwater cave. The track for this area especially, and the general untouched feel of this cave gives it a good sense of atmosphere. The problem is that while it certainly looks cool, it doesn't play cool. The area is like one big long maze, with a number of paths leading to absolutely nowhere. It's not really too hard to get stuck in this place for a while, as areas that would seem important on the outset usually end up being dead ends. The rooms themselves as well tend to be a bit on the larger side and not in a good way. I mean, I get it, it's an underwater cave that the space pirates seem to avoid. Shouldn't it be kind of open? I mean, sure, but the difference is that these rooms are super barren. Oftentimes the rooms have nothing but a bunch of platforms spaced about by nothing but water. Enemies as well tend to be pretty underwhelming here, as most of them tend to just swim around without caring much for Samus. So not only are the rooms barren, but there's not really much combat either. It's really just a bunch of floating around through empty rooms until you find something to do. And it doesn't help that this is the only place that the room design starts to feel kind of samey, as in the rooms are harder to differentiate, probably due to the open barren design. And because this is a giant maze, the area as a whole just feels like one long bland slog that design-wise would fit a lot better in a game like Metroid 2 than it does in Super Metroid. It's not the worst thing in the world, I guess, but I gotta be real, this is the one part of the game I dread while replaying it. Probably doesn't help that the bosses here are the weakest in the game, with some pretty easy to spot patterns and very few ways of really doing much to the player. But wait, did I say bosses? Yeah, that's right. Unlike previous games where bosses were limited in appearance and importance, Super Metroid finally brings in bosses as a big focus. Pretty much every area has some kind of major boss, and while not all of them are super great, there are a couple of notable ones I feel deserve some praise. Something you'll notice about the bosses in this game, especially early on, is that they really aren't too big, most of the time just filling up part of the screen at largest. And so, when you finally get to Kraid, the fight ends up feeling fairly neat. Fighting a boss so big that it can't even fit on one screen is super impressive from a spectacle standpoint. It requires you to try and deal with something which can only be targeted at the very top, and yet can hit you regardless of where you are on the screen. It's a cool boss as a whole, and feels like a much bigger victory than previous enemies. Crocomire also has a neat gimmick going on. Up to this point, defeating a boss was about hitting its weak point until it has enough damage, but that won't work against Crocomire. Instead, the player must shoot missiles when he opens his mouth until he gets off the edge of this platform and falls in the lava. It's a neat change of pace, and really rewards people who went back to find more upgrades, as having a lot of super missiles makes this fight way easier. Now, those are cool and all, but they are nothing compared to the coolest and most built-up boss in this game. That being Samus's eternal rival, the murderous space pirate Ridley. Let me give some context. This is the first enemy you fight in this game, and the first thing to leave a major impression. His monstrous form, his scary design, it's really hard not to be taken in by Ridley. And of course, he practically trounces you, and while holding the baby Metroid to boot. Even while disadvantaged by having to be careful with holding it, he still absolutely decimates you, and this is important because it sets the bar you need to reach. I mean, if Samus can get enough power-ups and upgrades to beat Ridley, then it only makes sense that she could face any challenge afterwards. And so you spend the game slowly but surely building up a legion of ridiculous weapons and abilities, get more health, and have missiles pouring out of your pockets almost literally. And so, after trekking through one of the hardest, most challenging areas in the game, you finally reach Ridley. And this fight, I mean, wow, it's brutal. All the bosses up to this point have been fairly static, not really having anywhere near the maneuverability of Samus during the fight. Ridley is the exception, being able to fly around the stage at a rate even better than Samus, and even managing to be completely unfazed by the screw attack, which up to this point is the most powerful ability Samus has. It's kinda crazy. In fact, something interesting is that despite the difference in size and build, Ridley really does feel like he has a lot of things parallel to Samus. He has the ability to freely fly about the stage just like Samus. He has a brutal and powerful projectile attack that pretty much negates anything thrown at it. Just as he can completely negate Samus' screw attack, so too can she halt several of his attacks with some quick thinking. They parallel each other so well, but even then, Ridley still feels like he has the advantage in several situations, even being able to grab Samus, which isn't something she can really do to him. And man, can Ridley really deal out some damage. Any hit from him does a ton of damage. He can really tear your health down if you're not careful. This is the point where it feels like exploration of the previous areas really comes in handy, as any extra health or super missiles you have can really make the difference between life or death here. It's no wonder Ridley left such a huge impression, and no wonder why the guy finally making it into Smash Bros. Was such a big deal. Considering the final boss is more of a cutscene than a fight, it only makes sense to make this last fight feel like the real final boss, and boy does Ridley do a good job of that. But anyways, you finally make it past Ridley and head down to Turian, the likely location of the baby Metroid. And you find it, and it almost kills you, leaving you with 1 health, almost like it realized who Samus was just before it was going to finish the job. Following this, you fight Mother Brain in a very familiar looking chamber, complete with shooting missiles at the glass and then at her to finish the job. Seems a little too simple, right? Well, of course it is. Mother Brain pulls out its new body, and after a little bit, hits Samus with an undodgeable beam that decimates her health bar. But just as it seems like it's over, the baby Metroid comes out and saves the day, siphoning power from Mother Brain and giving it to Samus. But in the end, Mother Brain kills off the baby Metroid just in time for Samus to get the power to really lay the smackdown on Mother Brain. This is something the series hasn't really tried up to this point, trying to get the player at least a little bit emotional. I mean, you saved this thing in Metroid 2, only for it to return the favor to only be brutally killed right after. While it doesn't really get me tearing up, it certainly does feel like something significant was lost, and gives weight to Metroid 2 that it wouldn't normally have. And then, as per the Metroid tradition, a countdown timer begins and Samus must escape the planet before it self-destructs, potentially saving some animals on the way if you feel like it. It's such a roller coaster ending, and I gotta admit, there aren't many games that can match the sheer adrenaline that Super Metroid gives you in these events. I really don't see how this ending could be done any better than this. It's a perfect cap-off to one of the greatest games in the series. And you know, I've said some complaints about this game, but the funny part is that these parts do virtually nothing to tarnish just how much of a masterpiece this game is. I'm one of those people that believes a game can be flawed but still be considered a masterpiece in the end. Don't get me wrong, Meridia is a slog and accounts for what is essentially about a sixth of the game. That is certainly a sizable chunk, but I don't think it really matters in the end. Super Metroid does so much right that it's really hard to even focus on Meridia, which even on its own still has some pretty cool parts about it. The game has a focus on environmental storytelling and a sense of detail unparalleled by anything that came before it. Everything about it is memorable, in most cases in a good way as well. Its non-linear approach to upgrade design lends the game a replayability unlike most games at the time. More than anything, you can tell that the developers really put a lot of love into this one, that they sincerely wanted to make an experience unlike any other. And you know what? They succeeded with flying colors. There are few Metroidvania games, or heck, few games in general that can claim to be even half the game Super Metroid is. It's a masterpiece despite any flaws it may have, and it's no surprise that this game gets as much praise as it does. Sure, it's sad that this game essentially overshadowed the accomplishments of its predecessor, but with how magnificent Super Metroid turned out, I think it's a loss I can deal with. But where do you go after a game like this? I mean, if you've essentially created one of the best Metroidvania games ever, where do you go from there? Do you try to top it? Well, the developers had a different plan in mind for Metroid, as the next game in the series would take a drastic change, one so big that it split the fan base around it. But how did it turn out? Well, we'll have to wait until next time when I cover Metroid Fusion for the Game Boy Advance, the Metroid series' own Black Sheep. Until then, I guess that's game over. Analysis. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed. And if you enjoyed this video, why not check out my previous videos on Metroid 1 and 2, or perhaps check out my video on Deltarune, or even my video on Death Note games. There's a solid selection of great stuff to watch, so I hope you stick around. And hey, why not subscribe? Anyways, I'll see you guys in the next video.